This presentation will give you a brief introduction to what I am calling the archaic modes. The French typically call them the mother modes. These modes are not discussed in any medieval treatises. They do, however, appear in the chants themselves. The documentation of their structure and evolution to the octoechos, or the 8 ecclesiastical modes, was largely the work of Dom Jean Clair, a monk of Salem, and a student of Dom Eugène Cardin, the father of semiology. First, a couple of terms. Every mode has a final and a dominant. The final is somewhat analogous to the tonic of a scale, at least in the fact that it is the principal note of the composition. A chant always ends on its final, which of course is not always the case with the tonic of a scalar composition. So take for example this antiphon, Hosanna Filii David, sung on Palm Sunday. It is not, by the way, on an archaic mode, but in mode 7 of the octoechos, which is a mode with the final of sol. We see that this chant begins and ends on its final, sol. A chant does not always begin on its final, but it always ends on its final, always. We see, too, that this chant has a psalm tone attached to it, that is, a formula to which verses of the psalm are sung between reiterations of the antiphon. This brings us to the discussion of the dominant. The dominant has two characteristics. First, it is the note of recitation for the psalm tone associated with any given chant. Mode 7's dominant is re. We see here that the reciting tone, that is the note on which most of the text is recited or sung, is re. The dominant is also a principal note of composition in the antiphon. It provides a second pole of attraction, as it were, that contrasts to the attraction of the final. Conceptually, this is not radically different from the notion of the dominant and its relationship to the tonic in tonal music. However, the way this relationship unfolds in modal chants is significantly different than it is in tonal music. For the purposes of this introduction, suffice it to say that the second characteristic of the dominant is that it is a principal note of composition in the antiphon, providing a second pole of attraction that contrasts to the attraction of the final as the principal note of the composition. In this antiphon, we see the intonation immediately rise to the dominant, and the first and last phrases center around this important pitch. With regard to the archaic modes, there are three. Each is a single pole mode. That is to say, the final and the dominant are the same pitch. The first archaic mode is that of do. Its characteristic structure is that of a whole step above the final and a half step, often ornamented to a minor third, below the final. Let's take a look at this short antiphon, Tu es Deus qui facis mirabilia. You are God who does wondrous things. We see immediately that do is both the principal note of composition and the final. It is ornamented by a drop to the minor third below and a rise to the whole step above. This is a very simple example. Others will have more complex ornamentation, but the basic structure will be the same. At the end of the antiphon, we see the ending formula for the psalm tone. Every antiphon will have at the end a formula like this. The letters E, U, O, U, A, E under the formula stand for the letters of the ending of the Gloria Patri sung at the end of every psalm. The verse is Gloria Patri et Filii et Spiritui Sancto, sic ut erat in principio et nunc et semper, et in saecula saeculorum. Amen. So the verse ends, or the doxology ends, with the words saeculorum. Amen, which contain the vowels E, U, O, U, A, E. There are numerous possible endings for every psalm formula, and the ending that is chosen and attached to each antiphon is the one that will make the transition back to the antiphon the easiest. For the purposes of this presentation, we see that the tone of recitation for the psalm tone, the first notes of the ending formula, is also do. The second archaic mode is that of re. Its characteristic structure is that of a whole step above the final and a whole step below the final. Here we see an ancient formula for the versicle in Vespers, Dirigatur Domine oratio mea. Let my prayer rise, O Lord. The versicle begins on re and has a recitation on the same note. There is an ornamented cadence with the piece resting on the final of re. Again, a very simple example. Others will have more complex ornamentation, but the basic structure will be the same. Finally, the third archaic mode is that of mi. Its characteristic structure is that of a half step above the final and a whole step below the final. This example is another short antiphon from the Divine Office. Clamavi et exaudivit me. I cried out and he heard me. The antiphon is built on mi, its final. It begins on mi, descends away from it, returns, and then concludes with a cadence formula that highlights the tension between the whole step below and the half step above the final before the piece concludes on its final. The psalm formula, with its reciting tone on mi, has the same ending formula as the antiphon. These archaic modal structures appear throughout the repertoire, sometimes in pristine examples such as these. More often, however, they will show themselves in sections of more modern, more developed pieces, where we can see the evolution of these structures to the octoechos. We'll take a look at more examples of these archaic structures when we study the modes of the octoechos.